Hi, I am Mara Ragan, and I am here with Dr. James Ragan, who was so gracious to give us a moment of his time for this interview. Thank you so much for joining me. Dr. Ragan is a distinguished visiting professor at Charles University in the Czech Republic, and he has agreed to talk with us about some of the effects of digitization in Czech Republic, and he's been following it. So I'm going to let him introduce himself a little more.
Thank you so much for letting me be part of the project. Just very quickly, I had been asked by the LA Times. I was a foreign correspondent for the LA Times, just very briefly, in Beijing. I had a Fulbright professorship, and they asked if I would file several reports on the arts, which I did. In 1988 and into 1989, without realizing that I was going to be part of a historical moment, and that was the Tiananmen Square massacres. And then from there, my heritage is Czechoslovakian, so then all the years I've been in Prague, I was then also writing for the Prague Post, as I had for the LA Times, where I reviewed for them for about 8 years too. But for the Prague Post, I was writing articles as well as reviewing and being reviewed. So that's a little bit of the background on my experience in the journalistic field.
Perfect. So we're going to start with the first question. How has digitization affected news media in the Czech Republic? Digitization being, for example, the change from print journalism over to online internet journalism.
Well, it's been slow in coming. Let me put it this way. I was there during the periods, for example, from the 60s, late 60s, and through the 70s until 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell. So it's important to realize how journalism was viewed and how it was used during that period. Usually, and most often, it followed a party line. In other words, you can only print basically what was approved. And this was never more clear than even on the television in terms of video journalism. I remember there was a show on Always that we watched, which was called In America Today. And this was the important thing about knowing everyone had a TV in the Czech Republic during the communist years. No one had a telephone. TV was an instrument of propaganda, and the telephone was an instrument of revolution. So basically, the idea of watching America Today was for them to be able to give us the propaganda, and in America simply meant all Americas. So one time I remember they were showing a famine, and you'd think it was America because that's what they wanted to believe, but it was Haiti. And this was constantly presented that way. So that was a journalism that was being broadcast from on video from Prague and from Bratislava into the villages. So with that in mind, with that kind of a context in mind, you can imagine what print journalism was like during that period, whether it was in Narodné Noviny. I was interviewed in there many times, and even had helped them with certain product and rather with context in terms of articles. But so it's been slow in coming. So let's just say that after 1989, with that Berlin Wall falling, it was the greater freedom that most journalists were experiencing allowed them to write a little more about subjects that they would never have touched. Slow in coming in the sense that the whole digital media that came into being, the digital journalism that came into being, let's say in a newspaper like the Prague Post, which had been 22 years in terms of print, English-speaking newspaper, very popular. Only a year ago did it actually go into digitization. It went online. And with that in mind, you suddenly saw what they told me, basically, because I had done some work for them recently, was that they had more hits on the online journalism than they ever had in print media. That one of the biggest problems they had was even e-subscriptions were very difficult to get. So it was a lot easier somehow. To get to e-subscriptions, it was a lot easier than to have print sales out there. So it was a lot easier to show. So that was the kind of changes that started happening. It happened in Prague Business Today, that newspaper. It happened in several other of the different magazines were being the daily English-speaking journals. They were now going to the internet, and so that was one of the changes that came through the ability. First of all, another thing I should say, and maybe it dovetails into other questions you'll have, but the other thing is that it gave a greater freedom also of people who were not so really journalists. They were basically people who wanted to somehow get their own video cameras. They would have their own digital editing machines, and as a result of that, were able to, put what essentially was blogging without sources, without any kind of. They could Photoshop whatever they did. So this was the problem that came with freedom. Freedom of journalism in a country that hadn't known freedom, is that it opened the doors to all people. There was no real education going on as to how can you use the different hardware or software that was available to you. So it's been slow in coming that way, but those magazines and newspapers that had been there had jumped aboard very early on. So it's become more and more the internet is one of the main sources of information in Prague. Long question, long answer to a very short question.
I understand that even the radio still has an extremely high percentage of listeners,
Right.
And they've even gone digital in a sense.
Right. Well, the interesting thing is that you've got three main sources. You have the internet, basically, the internet influence on journalism, of course. Then you have the radio journalism that never left. As a matter of fact, with Radio Free Europe already being in place, it was still one of the more popular places to get your truth. And then, of course, you had what was the video journalism. The problems too often with the video journalism is the same problem we sometimes experience here, that what started to sell, what started to become the information sources for many people there had more to do with the kind of tabloidization, or what we call the tabloid culture that we have here. For example, the day that we started seeing Lindsay Lohan and Paris Hilton and Britney Spears on the 6 o'clock news, or even Justin Bieber, as it is so often now, was the day that journalism had changed even here. It was a tabloid culture. Well, that influence is over there as well, except the tabloid culture in Prague has more to do with all the scandals that just lately have come into being. They weren't as prominent before, but now lately they've also captured the younger audiences that are there. You have to remember, the older audiences, the older people who suffered under communism all those years, still won't have any of the phones that we might have here with smartphones. That's just not there. Some of them still will not use the internet. Some of them definitely won't email. They still won't do any of that. So they're harder in coming to be an audience. So it is the younger generation that's changing the country and moving it more and more toward digitization in terms of the, just in terms of the television and digital revolution there.
I even understand in a lot of classrooms, the younger generations are predominantly the ones using the internet
Right.
for all of their schoolwork and things like that. So it's interesting to see, and it parallels, what's happening in the U.S. as well as other countries as well.
Right.
So are there any social media uprisings that have happened in the Czech Republic?
Well, in 1989, there was a very famous incident that occurred on Národní, one of the main streets there, the People's Road, where students were herded into a kind of a tunneled area of the street, and the police just beat them brutally. And that was the kind of revolution. Don't forget, the idea of the Prague Spring was just around that time, 1989, the Prague Spring, and that term became popular, didn't it, during the Arab Spring. We started using that now more commonly to describe any period where people were subjected to suffering or to a kind of an oppressive action. So in Prague, yes, that was the only time that after that occurred, because the students had believed they were going under a very peaceful protest. Already the wall had fallen, and yet in the papers the next day it rallied all the people, and pretty much after that day, communism was finished. But since then, there has been no need for any kind of a social media uprising of sorts. The younger generation, yes, they're tweeting, yes, they are Facebooking, yes, they are onto the internet, but they're not in the need, let's say, of that kind of a social revolution of sorts. Their freedoms are there, and they're abusing it in many ways, as I said, the blogging, and I'll maybe talk about that a little more. But it has its way of giving false information. It can, in a sense, work against truth in a very, not a harmful way, but it will take information into areas that make it a little more difficult for discourse in the country. But let's just say this. On May 1st, I was reading a report that came out that in the last 10 years, there's a 10-year low for global freedom of journalism in Eastern European and Asian countries. Don't forget Prague is Central Europe. So with that in mind, the freedoms that we're experiencing now are quite, I need a word, I suppose. There's not as flagrant as they are, in any abuses, because there's still a sense of an ethics, even though a code hasn't really been presented there until more recently. I think there's suddenly now the journalistic codes that have come into the Prague, but don't forget what existed there before allowed people to move with technology, and even with the television broadcast, the way they're able to broadcast, and Prague, even in film, became one of the primary sources for the how do you say it, advances in special effects. CGI. People still go there to shoot because the CGI allows them to. So just think of CGI also as another aspect that comes in to help a lot of these new journalists in terms of what they want to put on the screen, or even what they might need to put on the internet.
Well, that's a good segue into where do you think the future of journalism is going in the Czech Republic?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, the internet is one of the main sources of information, and DV technology, digital video technology, is advancing, as it is here in many ways. So I think more and more newspapers will start changing from paper format into online formats. And if I hadn't mentioned it already, I remember with the Prague Post, talking to the editor just very recently, where he said that every person in Prague wakes up in the morning and the first thing he does is go to the internet for his news, or he goes to his iPad, or he goes to his smartphone for the news. And I must tell you this, it wasn't that long ago when I attended a conference where there was a very well-known journalist who was explaining that you will at some point be able to literally have what will be a little bit of a box watch almost, and you will be able to just punch in and read the whole New York Times on it. You'll be able to read the entire, all of what you wanted, the Prague Post, of Los Angeles Times, anything you wanted on this. So it's already out there, by the way. But you'll see more and more of that kind of an advancement taking hold even in Europe, and especially in Prague. They're not afraid of advancing, as I said, but I'm fearful that they're also not afraid of turning the truth based on their own blogging opinions. They still haven't gotten to the point where the journalism, I think, is sourced, or it's, how do you say, researched? Mm-hmm.
Especially with user-generated content.
Especially with user-generated content, exactly. So, yeah, these are the concerns for the future, but I think they'll bring it together,